podcast.
If you are new to this program, what's about to unfold is not typical. Okay, so if you are brand new, this is your first go, welcome. Glad you're here. This episode is not typical, so go back to last week or the week before that or the week before that to get the flavor of what normally goes on around here. This episode is aimed more at your regular listeners because if you've been paying attention, I put up a meme which said no episode this week. And that's how I intended for this week to unfold. But I just have a real problem not doing an episode. And so what actually happened was I recorded an episode on Monday morning, as per usual, and it was on paper a good episode. Reasonable topic, and I planned it out. But you can just tell sometimes in the recording that it's not really working. Like it may work in your head academically, but you're just not feeling it. And I knew as I was recording, I was not in a great headspace for it. And I just wasn't plugged in. And you get what you get in those circumstances, right? I finished it and I set it aside. And then I went away knowing that it probably wasn't great. But I've had that circumstance before where I record one and I'm like, But then when I come back with fresh ears, it's actually better than I thought. So I set it aside, came back, started to listen to it, and it was like, yeah, this sucks. This episode just isn't any good. And I don't want to release episodes that aren't any good. Doesn't feel good to me. Doesn't feel good to you. And so the problem you run into, if you're me, is that when an episode doesn't work, you go very quickly from this episode doesn't work, meh, to what am I doing with my life? Why am I even doing this? What is the freaking point? It can escalate very quickly. And the weird sort of irony of that is as it escalates, I sink further down. So I find myself beginning to tip, right? And I have to pull myself back from that ledge. You know, one of the really, really great effects of mindfulness and of practicing some of these things is you begin to recognize your triggers. You begin to recognize when you're tipping, and it did not feel good inside. And so I went to bed Monday night. One of the reasons I record on Mondays and release on Wednesdays is so I have that Tuesday buffer for just such a circumstance. I went to bed on Monday night. And I didn't sleep really because my brain was just roiling with what can I do instead? What can I do instead? What can I talk about? And then I would go down one rabbit hole. I can do this, or I can try to talk about that, or I can do this, or I can do that. And it was a fretful and a not very good sleeping kind of night. So you wake up Tuesday morning, you're already in kind of a puddle because your episode didn't work. And you're just holding on with white knuckles to your mental health about it. And you didn't sleep, which just puts another dagger in it, right? When I'm tired, the mental health suffers. You've probably noticed that too. So we got two strikes against us, right? And I just kind of sat there on Tuesday going through all of this and going round and round in circles. And then I feel this obligation to the patrons and I feel this obligation to the audience. And I hold on to this, in some ways, almost detrimental integrity that when I say I'm going to do a weekly episode, I got to do a weekly episode. And so I'm feeling bad about that. And it's just a bad toxic soup, right? And so I just decided on Tuesday, I'm going to do the smart thing and I'm just going to not release an episode this week. And that's hard for me, but it's the best thing ultimately, right? And so I posted up the meme and noted that my John Candy meme got more attention than almost anything I ever post about the actual podcast. And so maybe I should just switch all of my socials to memes. Get a lot more interest that way. That's an aside. Put that up, thought I would step away. And all of this points to big questions, right? I have been struggling at times still with the direction of the podcast. You know, that question, what am I doing and why and what is this actually about, has been kind of an issue since day one. I kind of wandered into this without a script, literally and figuratively 5 years ago. And I've never really been able to answer this question of what am I doing? What is this about? People will say to me, hey, what's your podcast about? And I'll be kind of a deer in the headlights for a minute because I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't even really know. And so I'll mumble something about, well, we talk about a lot of music. It's about music mostly, which is up to a point true. And I'll leave it at that. And they'll usually seem satisfied and not interested, and off they'll go, right? And I've noticed over the past few weeks, over really the life of the show, I keep trying to be all podcasts to all people. So I'll do a history, and then I'll do something on personal development, spirituality. Then there'll be an episode about some band, and then there'll be an interview with somebody, and all of that is fine. There are podcasts out there that make that work, make that structure work, right? And I've always kind of struggled with not having it more focused and more streamlined. I've felt along the way like that has held the show back in some ways. And that could just be me, overthinking. I know that I'm often guilty of that. But one of the things I don't say when somebody asks me what your podcast is about is I don't say, well, it's about personal development. It's about personal growth. It's about spirituality. I never, ever say that to people. And that's really an important thing, right? Why do I not say that to people? I think it's because it's not cool. It seems as though my perception of that stuff is it is just not cool. And it's not interesting and it's not entertaining. And who cares about that? It's the legacy of being a little kid, a weird little church kid who didn't do all the stuff that all the other cool kids do, right? Didn't go to dances, didn't go to movies, didn't go to parties, didn't, in theory, listen to secular music. And when that's your reality and that's who you are in the normal world, you become very attuned and very sensitive to what's cool, right? To what cool is, because you know you ain't it. And so you're being kind of desperate in whatever way you can to seem normal like everybody else. It's just the legacy of growing up that way, right? And now you're a 50-year-old man, but some of that still persists. And so if you are kind of struggling with the self-doubt that I still struggle with, and if you grow up that way and you don't really develop a solid sense of your own ideas and your own intuition, you're always looking for somebody or something outside of you to validate your ideas and intuition, you just don't develop that muscle that says, this is what I want to do, this is what I am doing, and this is how I'm going to do it. You become very, very non-committal and wishy-washy about those things. And so I'm doing a podcast that really is about personal development, and then you cringe and you wait. You wait for people to kind of roll their eyes or for their eyes to glaze over, for them to look away, or for them to be disappointed because you're not doing some really hip, edgy, literary, unique thing, right? And this is all me projecting, right? Most people either are interested in what I'm talking about or we're only asking to be polite in the first. Like most people don't care. And most people, if you say you're doing a podcast about personal development, it's neither here nor there to them, and they don't care if your podcast is cool or not. But if you're still an 8-year-old kid or an 11-year-old kid in some ways inside, you become very defensive about that sort of thing, and you kind of wait for the lash. And it's like, no, I am cool. I am cool. So I never say that it's about personal development. I never say that it's about spirituality because I know those things are kind of cliche these days. I know there's a lot of eye rolling involved, but I also find, if I'm honest in this moment, and I'm 100% off the cuff here, a lot of people do respond. You know, when I begin to talk about the spiritual stuff, a lot of people do respond. And maybe that's the age range of my demographic. We're coming into midlife here, maybe even like late midlife we're coming into. Maybe some of those questions are relevant now, and I don't give myself enough credit for tackling some of them, or for talking openly about self-doubt or anxiety or any of these things, ego and attachment, all the stuff that I talk about that I'm so reluctant still to talk about because it's not cool, or my perception is that it's not cool. And also because I feel like an imposter all the time. Because who am I to be talking about these things? But again, I'm always coming at it from the frame of reference of my own experience. And I don't give myself enough credit for that either, right? But I still never say I'm doing a podcast about personal transformation. And I do find myself, and you'll notice this too, being all podcasters to all people, doing a road story, doing a history, doing an interview, doing whatever. And again, that can work great. If that's your vision, right? If that's what you want to bring to the table and the through line is in entertainment or whatever. I've always felt just a little bit like I have a dog's breakfast going here. And I don't think I manage a dog's breakfast all that well. And so you do an episode on Monday morning, which just doesn't jive. It just doesn't feel like that was really what you were intended to talk about, but then you don't have an answer to what you were intended to talk about. Then you cloud yourself over with overthinking. And all of this is still an indication that you don't have a rock solid self-identity, right? You're still kind of depending on outside forces, and you're either not listening to or not trusting your own inner tuition, your own intuition, your own voice. Something I continue to struggle with all the time, and it's one of the reasons why this podcast seems to go in so many freaking circles. So Tuesday, I'm feeling bad about that because I feel like I've let everybody down. I feel like I'm sinking down the drain again, and I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, and this is a waste of freaking time anyway, and the podcast has been stuck in first gear since the beginning, and all of that kind of piles on. And it's thanks only to some of the mindfulness work I've done and some of the self-awareness work I've done that I can recognize that and kind of hold it at bay without going down the sewer. And I did that. Okay, I posted up the thing that said I'm not doing an episode. Everybody freaking loved it, so thanks, John Candy. And I left it at that. And I was prepared to be comfortable with not doing an episode this week. Then last night, Tuesday night, I recorded a podcast interview. I am guesting on a new show that's got a few episodes out now. It's a really cool show. I'm not going to say anything about it because I don't want to jump that show's gun. But I recorded an episode. It's about music and by extension about musicians. And so I connected with the host and we did an episode. And it was a chance for me again just to tell my story and to talk a little bit about my story. And it's the story that most of you will know well by now, about how I was out of music for a long time, and then I came back to drums in my 30s and began to dedicate myself to it, but was so terrified to play in front of people that I didn't for almost 10 years. I was 40 by the time I started actually playing, and I talked about how the island or the Martinis in Jamaica whispered to me one day that you have to start playing music now. And it was this instruction that was not me. It was an intuition. It was spirit, whatever it was, that just told me to begin. And I had to screw up the courage to face what was an enormous fear of performing in front of people because it brought to light my feelings of inadequacy, feeling as though I'm not good enough. And it's going to be found out and exposed, and I'm going to be humiliated. When I get in the room with real and experienced players, we'll realize that I'm not that and never will be. But I came back, and as you know, I hooked up with Tyler and Mike. We formed Hiroshima Hearts eventually. And then there was that moment where we played our first gig together, and I was trembling walking up to that stage. Just this enormous, a legacy and a life of fear and self-doubt that came to a head in that moment. And I got to tell that story, and then I got to talk about how we got through that show and how I began to blossom, and then how opportunities came, and I had my music blog, and good things happen when you put yourself out there. And all of a sudden I find myself on the road with Carly Thomas, and then on the road with Sarah Smith, and all of these things blossoming from that one decision to step back into music, to step through that thin but convincing veil of fear. And I just got to talk about it. And then as an extension of that, or as part of that story, I talked about developing this podcast, which gave me a chance to really go back and examine the roots of this. And you know by now, I started this show for a couple of reasons. A, I was a hired musician and I kept coming back off of tours and falling into depressions because you live the life for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. You live the dream. You live this accelerated existence, and there's so much novelty and momentum and energy in it. And it feels so great to be out there actually doing it, what seemed impossible. And then you come back home and the artist you're playing with goes off and does other things or has other shows. You're just not on them. And there are no shows on your calendar. And so you go from living this accelerated life where you're living the dream and it's amazing. Then all of a sudden you find yourself in utter silence with nothing on the horizon. And you think it's over. You think it's over. And here I am back here again. And I can't sustain this financially. And I can't continue to do this. And that it leads me at least, into a depression. And a lot of musicians who are fortunate enough to be able to tour, even at my level, feel what they call the tour come down, which is living in this adrenalized life, this really elevated, accelerated life, and then coming home to this silence. And if you don't have anything to occupy yourself when you get back home, whether that's gigs or you're working on a record, whatever, you need a project that's yours. I learned this the hard way after going through these tour come downs and these depressions. I need something that's mine, that I don't need somebody to hire me for, that somebody can't arbitrarily let me go from after I've invested in it. I need something that's mine. And I had avoided podcasting for a long time because I knew it was going to take way more work than I thought. Because I've been through this before with blogs, etc. I know how these things can commandeer your time. I was reluctant to do it, but sometimes what's required for action is for the pain of not acting to be worse than the pain of acting. And so I started this podcast partly for that reason, and partly because I needed the proof. I needed the proof that it was possible to make your dreams come true, that it was possible to live this life permanently and not just in occasional 6-week chunks, right? And so I set out from the beginning to interview people, to have conversations with people who were actually doing it, people who were levels beyond, people who were the proof, and this is the key word, the inspiration that says it's possible to do this. And I'm talking about this last night, and I can sense in my own voice the energy coming into telling this story and remembering that the inspiration for this podcast was inspiration. I never say it's about personal growth and development because I'm really uncomfortable with that language and what I perceive to be other people's perceptions of it. But the truth is, this podcast was, in the beginning, simply about inspiration. And there has been a through line. Even though the format has changed, even though I've bounced around in terms of what I talk about, who I talk about it with, I've gone from interviews to solo mostly. But there's been a through line of inspiration that I hadn't really acknowledged or recognized until I was doing this podcast interview last night. A few years ago, before COVID, I was on the road with Sarah, and we were doing, I think, a 2-week run through the Maritimes, Eastern Canada. We were in Fredericton, just outside of Fredericton. We had played this really, really cool house venue. People had turned their basement into this just really great little room that held, 40 people maybe? They had sold it out, and the Sarah Trio was playing. It was a Visions and Voices tour. And what that was the Sarah band, the Sarah Trio, would go and perform with our friend Tanya Thomas, the medium, twice a guest on this podcast. And so what would happen is the Sarah Trio would set the mood with about 20 minutes of music. And then, because Sarah's music is very inspirational, and so we would do that to set the vibe. And then Tanya would come out and do her thing and blow people's minds for an hour and a half or whatever. And then we might do a couple of songs to wrap up and send people happily on their way. So we were doing a bunch of those shows. This house gig was just a Sarah headliner gig. And they sold the place out, and we went down and we played, and it was great. Really, really cool show in a really, really cool spot. Sometimes you wind up in those places. It's just this house on the outskirts of Fredericton. We stayed at the house. So the next morning we get up and I'm putting on my jeans, one leg at a time, kids, one leg at a time. Put my hand in my pocket and I feel something in there. And I'm like, what is that? I pull it out and it's this little object that would go on a keychain. It was designed for a keychain. It was like this wing kind of thing. I've told this before, but it bears telling again. And on one side it said, inspire on. There's that word again, inspire on. On the other side it said, you can do it. And to this day, I don't know how that got into my pocket or who put it there. I could make educated guesses, but I'm not going to, and I don't want to know. I prefer to hold on to the mystery. I prefer to hold on to this idea that life can give you clues, that life can give you messages. And I've been so reluctant to step into this discussion and this language about spirituality and about personal growth because, again, not cool and I'm not qualified. And you set yourself up in a way when you talk about these things as though you think you're some kind of guru and then you have to in some ways be perfect, right? I'm not that. And I'm not trying to be that. And I don't think I've presented it that way. I think I've presented all of this stuff as me just working through some of the pain points in my own life. And nobody's as special as they think they are. And so a lot of other people deal with the same kind of pain points. And I don't think there's anything self-important about discussing those things. I'm not super duper comfortable talking about myself. And it's another one of these things where I overthink it probably. This feeling as though I'm presenting myself as wise or spiritual or elevated, and everybody should listen to me talk about my life. What an arrogant thing to do. And I'm so careful and sensitive about that. And I'm sensitive about this whole world. I feel like an imposter in it. It feels silly to me. And I can picture people from my past who were hip and cool hearing about me talking about this stuff and thinking that's neither hip nor cool and neither are you. And that's for me to work through. Okay, one of the things that you do in developing a really solid self-concept is that you are immune to those things, or you can at least brush them off. And you can recognize and articulate and hold strong to your own vision. Now, I've not been good at that. It's one of the reasons why this podcast is a hodgepodge so much of the time. And there have been times along the way where I've thought, let's just make it a hodgepodge. If I identify it as such, then it's okay. And I will still do episodes that veer from the trajectory because something comes along that interests me and I want to talk about it. I mean, this is what I call a personality podcast. And that's what it is. That's what it does. But I've needed it to hang on something a little bit more solid. And so last night doing this podcast interview, I rediscovered this notion of inspiration. And so it's just something for me to think about. And I wanted to come on here today and just do a short one just to talk about this process. Because I think probably a lot of you, I know for a fact that a lot of you are creators, and you probably run into this brick wall once again, where the thing you're working on isn't working, and you may have the luxury of not being on a weekly publication schedule. I don't have a team of writers over here, but you run up against it. And some of the time when you run up against it, it's because you're trying to be all things to all people. And in the process of doing that, you've lost a sense of whatever spark launched the thing in the first place, right? I know musicians have this all the time. They got to write to the market. But my favorite style of music to write and play is hair metal. Sorry, you got to do pop now. And it doesn't work for them. And they find themselves trying to incorporate this mishmash of styles and influences. And they lose the purity. They lose the purity of whatever was theirs to give in the first place. And I've never really known what's mine to give in the first place with this podcast. But I think it's something to do with that, with this inspiration that I'm so reluctant to own and to step into. And that's another lesson. Or if there's a thing that you can tell deep down in your heart of hearts that you're afraid to step into creatively, that you're afraid to own, that you're afraid to be associated with, and only you can answer that. But you know deep down inside that there's a place that you're inclined to go, that you're reluctant to go for whatever reason, for whatever pain that brings. Maybe it's a fear of ostracism. Maybe it's a fear of not being cool. Maybe it's a fear of not being good enough to meet the standards you see in whatever that is. It's a clue, though. If that fear exists, it exists for you to step through. And I'm dealing with that right now. Feeling silly about having a podcast that is fundamentally about personal growth and inspiration. Feels lame to me. And I feel self-conscious about it. And that tells you that there's a thing to be worked on there. There's a thing to be examined. And so yesterday, the day before, I'm having this twisted up feeling inside, this really bad feeling. Partly it's my own self-talk about how I don't know what I'm doing and I'm getting nowhere. And what's the point of all this? And feeling that rotten feeling inside. And there's a school of thought, you will find this in the work of Abraham Hicks, the school of thought that says that when you feel those things, you feel this frustration with yourself, you feel this negativity about yourself, this anger, usually that represents a conflict between your higher self, let's say your soul, and your conscious self, your lower self, where they're not agreeing with each other. So I'm sitting here saying I'm wasting my time with this podcast and it's pointless. And why do I bother? And what's the point anyways? I can't do this and I should quit. And that's a negative feeling. And my higher self, though, maybe soul, utterly disagrees with that. And that's why you feel this negative feeling. You're not in alignment anymore. You're broken. The connection is broken. My higher self is saying, you're good at this. You have something to offer here. You can do some service with this program if you'll only step into what it's meant to be. And my lower self is resisting that. And when the two are not in alignment, you get this negative feeling inside. And it's just a way to think about. Maybe it's literally true. If you don't want to see it that way, it's a way to think about if you're feeling really negative about something, to do with yourself or whatever it is you're creating or working on. Stop and think, is a part of me just disagreeing with my own opinion or self-talk about this? And that's another thing for me to explore. I've been avoiding owning the spiritual side of this for a lot of reasons. We don't need to go into all of them, but it's just an acknowledgement. And I recognized it last night as I was telling the story that the inspiration was inspiration. And so it's a thing for me to consider going forward. And that's really all I wanted to say today. I just wanted to pop up with that kind of revelation. This is why there wasn't an episode. This is why there now is. And it's food for thought. And so, yeah, this is not a typical episode, right? If you're brand new and you came this far, God love you. God love your boots. I am going to give you a music recommendation before I sign off. It's a quick episode. It's a band from Australia called Boudica, Boudicca, I want to say. And I should give them way more airtime than I'm giving them right now. They released a song last week called The Witch of King's Cross, and it's about this really compelling historical figure called Rosaline Norton, 1917 to 1979. And she was an artist and a writer and an occultist, and she caused scandal after scandal after scandal for her occultic work and her occultic beliefs. And at a time in Australia and elsewhere in the Western world, 50s, 60s, very, very traditional, conservative, Christian sort of frame of reference for everything. She was a major league thorn in the side, this occultic artist who painted creepy stuff. Goat men with serpent penises, you know what I mean? That'd be a great title for this episode. Rosaline Norton. And you can go online and you can find out all about her. And this band Boudica, also from Australia, they're like a punk, really hardcore punk / metal band. And they write songs inspired by strong women. That's their whole thing. The name Boudica comes from a Celtic warrior princess called Boudica, who led a rebellion against the Romans back in the 1st century AD. Burned Londonium, the city of London, to the ground, fighting off the Romans, okay? They're all about strong women, and they've written this song about Rosaline Norton called The Witch of King's Cross. King's Cross is kind of a bohemian neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, where the artists go and the freaky people, a lot of sex trade, a lot of drugs, presumably. And Rosaline Norton, after a very colorful life, took up residence there and became known as the Witch of King's Cross. And I really dug this song. I dig this song. It's more metal than punk, in my opinion. And the female singer has just this wonderful kind of growl. You know how I feel about screechy vocals? I either love them or I hate them. And in this case, I really like her screech. And there's just a great chugging riff on this thing. It's heavy, it's aggressive, it's in your face. There's a great lyric in it. It says, "Us together, difficult women. Being loathed is tough, but we're tougher." They're not worried about owning who they are and what they do, are they, kids? That's Boudica, the song, The Witch of King's Cross. And I dig it. And if you are not so much into some of the shoegazy or singer-songwriter stuff I've been posting, want to bang your head a bit, want to rock and roll, that's the tune to go check out this week. I'll put it on the playlist. I'm going to wrap this podcast episode right now because I have to completely edit and produce it today. This is the morning of Wednesday, so this is as fresh as it gets, kids. Thanks for indulging me and being understanding about me apparently not releasing an episode this week. A lot to think about. A lot to think about with the direction of this thing, and it's timely. We're coming up very, very soon on the 5th anniversary of the podcast. I got some thinking to do about it. I appreciate all of you listening this far in this episode, this far in this program, 186 episodes. Where did they all come from, you know? Thanks for your feedback. Please do consider sharing these episodes, telling a friend. If you're getting something from it, just please consider sharing. Ratings, reviews, patreon.com/John Huff Podcast, etc., etc., etc. Thank you ever so much for indulging me. And we'll see what the week brings, kids. Until then, consider your negative feelings and why they might represent a disconnect between higher and lower self. And think about what you're not owning creatively or in your personal life that maybe it's time you consider owning, okay? Gonna shutting up. Thanks for listening. Thanks for everything, kids. And hey, I'll check you later. Yeah. Can't do a screech like Boudica, and I don't have time to think of something different. So enjoy this Easter egg on Easter, which is this weekend.